A family celebration turns into a nightmare when a shocking betrayal is exposed. A trusted husband, a best friend, and a devastating secret. What happened at this graduation party will leave you speechless. Stay until the end to uncover the chilling truth that shattered lives forever. Don't miss out on more gripping stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And we want to hear from you. What would you do if faced with a betrayal like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The backyard shimmered with string lights and colorful banners, each one shouting congratulations to Emma, the star of the day. Guests milled around, glasses clinking and laughter filling the air. Tables were piled high with food, and a cake sat proudly in the center, marked with the words, "You did it, Emma." It was a moment Emma had been dreaming of for months. Her graduation party, a day to celebrate her hard work and a promising future. At first glance, the family hosting the event seemed perfect. Sarah, Emma's mother, flitted between groups of guests, her smile warm, but her eyes scanning the crowd with purpose. David, Emma's father, stood confidently near the barbecue, shaking hands and making jokes that drew easy laughter. Emma glowed, her cap and gown from the morning ceremony draped over her chair as she chatted with her best friend, Lily. They were inseparable, practically sisters since childhood. But beneath the surface, the perfect image was starting to crack. Sarah's gaze lingered on David and Lily longer than necessary, her jaw tightening as she caught the faintest flicker of something between them. A shared laugh, a hand brushing a little too close. Sarah's stomach churned, though she kept her expression neutral. She'd prepared for this moment, planned for it carefully, and tonight was her stage. She would expose the truth for everyone to see, no matter the cost. As the evening deepened and the crowd grew louder, Sarah retreated to the kitchen under the guise of grabbing more ice. She stood by the counter, gripping the edge tightly, her thoughts racing. She had seen enough over the past few weeks to piece together the unimaginable. The late-night phone calls, the mentoring sessions David claimed were harmless, and the way Lily's demeanor shifted whenever Sarah entered the room, it all painted a horrifying picture she couldn't ignore. The first clue had been an accident, a forgotten phone left on the couch. A message had popped up on David's screen. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." At first, Sarah had assumed the message was from another woman, and she had felt the sting of betrayal rise in her chest. But as she scrolled further, piecing together the fragments of their exchanges, the truth hit her like a freight train. Lily. It was Lily, her daughter's best friend. A wave of nausea hit Sarah, and she leaned against the counter, forcing herself to breathe. How could he do this? How could Lily? The betrayal ran deep, tangled in the relationships she had thought were unshakable. But Sarah wasn't one to crumble. She was calculating, determined. Tonight, she would let the truth come out in the most public, devastating way possible. David thought he had control, but he was wrong. Returning to the party, Sarah moved with a new kind of calm, her movements deliberate. She watched Lily closely now, noticing the nervous way she avoided her gaze and clutched her drink like a lifeline. David, meanwhile, played the role of doting father perfectly, keeping the guests entertained with his charisma. But Sarah saw the cracks in his mask, the way he glanced at Lily too often, the subtle tension in his shoulders whenever Sarah was near. As she approached Emma, who was laughing with a group of friends, Sarah placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Emma turned to her mother with a wide grin, her happiness radiating. "This is perfect, Mom. Thank you for everything." Sarah smiled back, though her heart ached for her daughter's innocence. "Anything for you, sweetheart," she said softly, her eyes flickering briefly to Lily. The truth was coming, and Sarah could only hope Emma would understand why she had to do this. The moment of reckoning was near, and there was no turning back. The party was in full swing, with music thumping gently in the background and guests clinking glasses in celebration. Sarah moved through the crowd like a shadow, her eyes never straying far from David and Lily. She watched the way his hand lingered on her shoulder when he whispered something in her ear. It was quick, subtle enough that most would miss it. But Sarah didn't. Her chest burned with anger, but she swallowed it down. She needed patience. Lily seemed to sense the eyes on her. Her movements were jittery, her smile forced. She sipped nervously at her drink, her gaze darting between David and Sarah. Every time Sarah caught her eye, the girl looked away quickly, her face reddening. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if guilt was eating away at her, or if it was fear. Across the yard, David was speaking to a group of colleagues, his laughter loud and easy. He looked every bit the devoted family man, but Sarah knew better. He had been sloppy, careless. The messages on his phone had been damning enough, but it was more than that. The late nights, the lies about business meetings, the way he always seemed to find reasons to help Lily with her studies. It had all been too much to ignore. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when Emma approached her, beaming. "Mum, you've got to try this punch. It's so good." Emma held out a cup, her excitement contagious. Sarah smiled and took a sip, nodding approvingly. "Delicious," she said, though her mind was far from the sweetness of the drink. Emma didn't seem to notice her mother's distraction. "This is the best day ever," she said, her voice full of joy. "I can't believe you and Dad did all this for me." Sarah felt a pang of guilt at the mention of David. She wanted to shield Emma from the storm that was coming, but there was no way to avoid it. The truth had to come out. "You deserve it," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on Emma's cheek. "Everything we've done is for you." Emma tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly. "Are you okay, Mom? You seem, I don't know, tense." Sarah forced another smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired. You enjoy yourself, okay?" As Emma wandered back to her friends, Sarah turned her attention to the far side of the yard, where David and Lily now stood together. They were speaking in low voices, their bodies angled toward each other. Sarah felt her blood boil as she watched Lily laugh nervously at something David said. It was too intimate, too familiar. Suddenly, Lily glanced in Sarah's direction, her eyes widening slightly when she realized she was being watched. She stepped back from David quickly, nearly bumping into a guest. David's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly, turning to address someone else. The interaction was over in seconds, but it was enough. Sarah's grip tightened around her glass. They were unraveling, their perfect little secret slipping through their fingers. She wasn't sure if it was guilt or arrogance that was making them careless, but it didn't matter. Their mistakes were playing right into her hands. The night wasn't over yet, far from it. The warm evening air carried the hum of conversation and laughter, but to Sarah, the party felt suffocating. She stayed on the edges, letting her presence blend into the background while she observed every interaction. The calm mask she wore belied the storm inside her. Her hand tightened around the stem of her wineglass as she watched Lily nervously pick at the hem of her dress, avoiding eye contact with anyone who came near. David, meanwhile, had slipped into a quieter corner of the yard, his phone in hand. He was scrolling quickly, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Sarah's breath caught as she remembered the messages she'd read just days ago. She didn't need to see the screen to know who he was messaging. The casual way he stood there, confident in his deceit, made her stomach turn. Did he think he was untouchable, that she wouldn't have the nerve to confront him? Sarah moved closer, blending into a group of guests nearby, her ears straining to catch any words. David's voice was low and steady, as he ended a call with a quick, "I'll take care of it later." The nonchalance of his tone sent a chill through Sarah. He sounded so sure of himself, so smug. She bit her lip, her anger threatening to surface. Not yet, she reminded herself. Timing was everything. As she stepped back, her shoulder brushed against Lily, who had been moving toward the same corner. The girl froze, her face flushing as she turned to face Sarah. "Oh, Mrs. Turner, I didn't see you there," Lily stammered, her voice cracking slightly. Sarah studied her carefully, her smile tight. "No problem, Lily," she said smoothly. "Enjoying the party?" Lily nodded quickly, too quickly. "It's amazing. You and Mr. Turner went all out." Sarah tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, we wanted everything to be perfect for Emma. She deserves it, don't you think?" Lily fidgeted with her bracelet, avoiding Sarah's piercing gaze. "Of course. Emma's amazing." Sarah leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "And I've always thought so highly of you, Lily. You've been such a good influence on her. Like family." Lily's eyes darted up wide and startled, as if she were trying to read the hidden meaning in Sarah's words. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then she nodded again and quickly excused herself, nearly stumbling as she walked away. Sarah watched her go, her jaw tightening. The guilt was written all over Lily's face, and every awkward step she took screamed of secrets she couldn't keep buried. Sarah felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. She had cared for Lily, treated her like a second daughter. That made the betrayal cut even deeper. The evening was dragging on, the cheerful facade of the party now grating against Sarah's nerves. David returned to the crowd, effortlessly slipping into his role as host again, his laugh loud and practiced. But Sarah saw through it all. She saw the way his eyes lingered on Lily as she sat on the edge of the patio, nervously sipping her drink and keeping her head low. Sarah smiled faintly to herself, a plan solidifying in her mind. The cracks in their little secret were growing wider by the minute, and soon the entire thing would collapse. It was only a matter of time. The laughter and chatter around the yard began to blur, fading into a dull hum in Sarah's ears as she focused on her targets. David's polished charm was still working on the guests, but Sarah could see the slight twitch in his jaw when he thought no one was looking. He wasn't as calm as he wanted everyone to believe. The cracks in his perfect facade were growing, and Sarah wasn't about to let him patch them up. Lily had retreated to the edge of the yard, her drink untouched in her hands. She sat alone now, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a tense, withdrawn posture. She kept her eyes on the ground, occasionally glancing toward David. It was obvious to Sarah that the girl was unraveling under the pressure. She couldn't decide if it was guilt, shame, or fear, or all three, but whatever it was, it had Lily squirming. Sarah approached her casually, her heels clicking softly against the patio stones. Lily didn't notice her at first, and when she finally looked up, her face turned pale. "Oh, Mrs. Turner," she said quickly, her voice shaking. I needed some air." Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Lily. It's been such a long day for all of us." She paused, tilting her head slightly as she studied the girl. "You look tired, though. Are you okay? You seem distracted." Lily opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, her gaze darting toward the crowd. "I'm fine. Just a little overwhelmed, I guess." Sarah murmured, her tone light but laced with something sharper. "You know, I've always thought of you as part of the family, Lily. You've been such a good friend to Emma, like a sister to her." Lily swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of her drink. That means a lot," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only Lily could hear. I'm glad to hear that, because family doesn't keep secrets from each other, right? The girl's hands trembled, and her eyes darted around the yard as though searching for an escape. Of course not, she mumbled, her voice cracking. Before Sarah could press further, Emma's laughter rang out from the other side of the yard, pulling both of their gazes toward her. She was surrounded by friends, her face glowing with joy as she posed for pictures, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. For a moment, Sarah felt a pang of guilt, her resolve wavering as she watched her daughter's happiness. But the feeling was fleeting. Emma deserved to know the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. Sarah turned back to Lily, her smile tightening. "You should get back to Emma," she said, her tone softer now. "She's the reason we're all here tonight." Lily nodded quickly, almost too eagerly, and stumbled to her feet. She mumbled something that sounded like an apology before disappearing into the crowd. Sarah watched her go, her expression unreadable. The girl was barely holding herself together, and it wouldn't take much to break her completely. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of her plan settling heavier on her shoulders. She glanced across the yard, her eyes locking onto David, who was now pouring drinks for a small group of guests. He laughed at something someone said, but there was a stiffness in his posture that only Sarah seemed to notice. He was slipping too, and he didn't even realize it. The night wasn't over yet, but Sarah could feel the end approaching. The perfect moment to shatter their world was close, and she wasn't going to miss it. The air felt heavier as the night wore on, a sharp contrast to the lively energy that had filled the yard earlier. The conversations became quieter, the laughter less frequent, and the guests started to cluster in smaller groups. Sarah could sense it, the simmering tension building with every passing moment. Her plan was moving exactly as she had envisioned. All she needed now was the right opportunity to strike. David, oblivious to the trap tightening around him, had positioned himself near the drinks table, refilling his glass and engaging in small talk with a guest. His smile was still bright, his laughter still warm, but Sarah could see the thin layer of sweat on his brow. He wasn't as confident as he wanted people to believe. Sarah's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile as she made her way toward him. On the other side of the yard, Lily lingered near Emma, clinging to her presence as though it would shield her from the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Emma, still basking in the glow of the evening, seemed completely unaware of the strange tension between her best friend and her parents. She laughed and joked, pulling Lily into photos, her arm slung affectionately over the girl's shoulder. Sarah's chest tightened at the sight. Emma was so happy, so trusting, and she had no idea that her world was about to collapse. Sarah stopped a few feet from David, pretending to study the array of bottles on the drinks table. He noticed her immediately, his smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "Having fun?" he asked casually, though his tone was a little too bright, a little too forced. Sarah poured herself a glass of wine, her movements deliberate. "Oh, I'm having a wonderful time," she said evenly. She raised the glass to her lips, her eyes locking onto his. "And you? Enjoying yourself?" David chuckled, though it sounded hollow. "Of course. It's a great party, isn't it? Emma's so happy." "She is," Sarah agreed, her voice calm, but with an edge that made David glance at her nervously. She sipped her wine, letting the silence between them stretch just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. "It's a shame, though." His brow furrowed, the smile slipping slightly. "What is?" Sarah placed her glass down gently on the table, her gaze steady. "That happiness doesn't last forever. Sometimes people take it for granted, ruin it." David's face froze for a moment, his expression carefully neutral. Then he forced another laugh, shaking his head. "You're being dramatic, Sarah." "Am I?" she asked quietly, her eyes boring into his. He faltered under her stare, glancing away and rubbing the back of his neck. Before he could respond, a loud burst of laughter drew their attention to Emma and Lily. Emma was holding up a photo on her phone, showing it to the group around her, while Lily laughed nervously, her eyes darting toward Sarah. The sight sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through Sarah. David followed her gaze, and she caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Panic, perhaps? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a forced nonchalance. "They're just kids, Sarah," he said quietly, his tone almost dismissive. "You're reading too much into things." Sarah turned back to him, her expression hardening. "Am I?" she repeated, her voice sharper this time. David didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, muttering something about needing to check on the food. Sarah let him go, watching as he hurried across the yard, his movements tense and hurried. The storm was brewing, and Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. She glanced back at Emma, her sweet, innocent daughter, laughing with the girl who had betrayed her. The betrayal was unbearable, but it was David's arrogance that fueled her resolve. He thought he could charm his way out of this, manipulate her into silence. He had no idea what was coming. The time was near. One final push, and the truth would come crashing down. The yard had grown quieter now, the guests' energy settling into a subdued hum as the night stretched on. Most had gathered near the patio, sharing stories and enjoying the final hours of the celebration. Sarah stood near the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed loosely, her face a picture of calm. Inside, though, her mind raced. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, and now it was here, sitting heavy in her chest like a ticking clock. Emma's laughter still rang out, though even that felt slightly strained now, the fatigue of the long day beginning to show. She had her arm draped around Lily, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. The girl's smile was thin, her eyes darting nervously to Sarah and David at regular intervals. The tension in Lily's posture was unmistakable, and Sarah could feel the moment building, each second pulling tighter on the invisible thread that connected them all. David hovered at the drinks table again, this time alone. His glass was nearly empty, and he stared into it like it held the answers to a question he didn't want to ask. Sarah knew he could feel it too, the weight of her unspoken words, the inevitability of the truth coming out. His shoulders were stiff, and every now and then he'd glance toward her, his expression flickering between defiance and fear. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking against the patio stones. The sound cut through the low murmur of conversation, and for a brief moment several heads turned in her direction. She ignored them, her focus locked on Emma, Lily, and David. The time for subtlety was over. She reached the center of the patio, her presence commanding enough to quiet the nearby conversations. With a deliberate motion, she picked up a champagne flute from the table and tapped it gently with a fork. The soft chime rang out, silencing the crowd almost instantly. All eyes turned to her, curious and expectant. "Thank you everyone for being here tonight," Sarah began, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel. "It means so much to our family to celebrate Emma's achievements with all of you. She's worked so hard to get here, and I couldn't be prouder of the young woman she's become." There was a smattering of applause, but Sarah raised her hand slightly, quieting them again. "But before we wrap up this evening, there's something I need to say. Something that I think everyone here deserves to know." David, who had been leaning casually against the table, straightened abruptly, his face paling. Lily froze in her seat, her glass slipping slightly in her trembling hand. Emma, oblivious to the tension, smiled at her mother, waiting for whatever heartfelt tribute she assumed was coming. Sarah turned her gaze to David, her expression unreadable. "David," she said slowly, the name falling from her lips like a challenge. You've always been so charming, haven't you? Always the life of the party, always the one everyone admires." David blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but no words came. The crowd's attention shifted to him now, murmurs rippling through the group. Sarah pressed on, her voice gaining strength with every word. "But charm can only get you so far," she said, her tone sharp now, "and eventually the truth catches up to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah turned her eyes to Lily, who looked as though she wanted to melt into the ground. The girl's face was a mask of panic, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to meet Sarah's gaze. "Lily," Sarah said, her voice soft but piercing, "I thought of you like a daughter. You were always welcome in our home, trusted with our family. With my daughter." Lily let out a small broken sound, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. Emma, still smiling faintly, looked between her mother and her best friend, confusion flickering across her face. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Sarah ignored her, her focus unwavering. "But you betrayed that trust, didn't you?" she continued, her eyes boring into Lily. "You and David both." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emma's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Mom? What is she saying?" Sarah took a step back, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured to David. "Ask your father," she said, her voice cracking just enough to betray the emotion she had been holding back. "Ask him about the messages, the late nights. Ask him why Lily can't even look me in the eye." Emma whipped around to face her father, her face pale and stricken. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking, "is this true?" David took a step forward, his hands raised defensively. "Emma, it's not what it sounds like." But Emma cut him off, her voice rising to a scream. "Don't lie to me," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare lie to me." Lily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. The crowd was frozen, too shocked to move, their murmurs growing louder with each passing second. David looked around helplessly, his confidence shattered, his mask slipping completely. Sarah stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and heartbreak. The truth was out now, raw and unfiltered, and there was no taking it back. The night had unraveled completely, and the storm she had been waiting for was finally here. The yard descended into chaos. Guests murmured and whispered among themselves, their shock and disbelief evident in every hushed word. Some looked toward Sarah with a mix of pity and awe, while others glanced at David, their expressions turning cold and judgmental. The once lively celebration had turned into a circus of scandal, and there was no salvaging it now. Emma stood rooted in place, her body trembling as tears streaked down her cheeks. Her breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just heard. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with desperation, silently pleading for an explanation that would undo it all. "Tell me she's lying," she choked out, her voice trembling with the weight of her disbelief. "Please, Dad, just tell me it's not true." David's face crumpled under the weight of her words. He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched as if he could somehow fix the unfixable. "Emma," he began, his voice cracking, "it's complicated. You don't understand." "Don't you dare!" Sarah cut in sharply, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare try to twist this around. You had your chance to come clean, David. You chose lies. You chose betrayal." David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, anger flashed in his eyes. "You don't know the whole story, Sarah," he snapped, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can just humiliate me like this, in front of everyone?" Sarah took a step closer to him, her face inches from his. "I'm not the one who humiliated you, David. You did that yourself the moment you decided to betray your family. Don't you dare try to shift the blame now." Lily, still sitting at the edge of the patio, let out a shaky sob, drawing everyone's attention to her. She looked utterly broken, her face pale and tear-streaked as she clutched her knees to her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Emma's gaze snapped to her, a mix of fury and heartbreak in her eyes. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she shouted, her voice raw. "You were supposed to be my best friend, Lily. My best friend. How could you—" Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands, her sobs shaking her small frame. The sight of Emma's pain hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she couldn't allow herself to falter. She turned back to David, her voice steady but laced with venom. "Do you see what you've done?" she demanded. "Do you see the damage you've caused?" David said nothing, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. For the first time that evening, he looked truly defeated. The man who had exuded confidence and charm all night was now reduced to a shell, his carefully crafted image shattered beyond repair. The guests began to scatter, their discomfort evident as they murmured their goodbyes. Some lingered, watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination, but most seemed eager to escape the awkwardness of the moment. Sarah didn't care. Let them talk. Let them spread the story far and wide. She had nothing to hide. Emma finally turned back to Sarah, her tear-streaked face full of anguish. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How long have you known?" Sarah's chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. "Long enough," she admitted softly. "I wanted to protect you, Emma, but you deserve to know the truth." Emma shook her head, her tears flowing freely. "You should have told me sooner," she said, her voice breaking. "You should have warned me." "I know," Sarah said, stepping forward and pulling Emma into her arms. Emma resisted for a moment before collapsing against her mother, her sobs muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." Lily stood shakily, her gaze darting between Sarah and Emma, her face filled with shame. "I should go," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Sarah said coldly, her eyes narrowing. "You should." Lily hesitated for a moment before turning and walking away, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched. The weight of her guilt hung heavy over her, and Sarah felt no sympathy. Lily had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. As the last of the guests filtered out, leaving the family alone in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration, Sarah looked at David one final time. "This is on you," she said quietly, her voice filled with finality. "You did this to us, and I hope it was worth it." David didn't respond. He simply stood there, silent and broken, as Sarah led Emma inside, leaving him alone in the darkness. The house was silent, save for the occasional muffled sobs coming from Emma's room. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a now cold cup of tea. The evening's events replayed in her mind like a haunting movie reel, the looks of betrayal, the broken trust, the devastating fallout. She had planned for this moment, but the aftermath was heavier than she had anticipated. Upstairs, Emma's door creaked open, and soft footsteps echoed down the stairs. When Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face was pale and swollen from crying. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside and sitting across from her mother. "Did you really know this whole time?" Emma asked quietly, her voice hoarse. Sarah took a deep breath. "Not the whole time," she admitted, "but long enough to know I couldn't keep it hidden anymore." Emma stared at the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on its surface. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why let me find out like that?" "I didn't want to hurt you," Sarah said softly. "I thought if I kept it quiet, I could protect you from the worst of it. But when I realized how deep it went, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Emma nodded slowly, her tears threatening to spill over again. "I feel so stupid," she whispered. "How could I not see it? How could I not know?" "It's not your fault, sweetheart," Sarah said firmly, leaning forward and placing a hand over Emma's. "None of this is your fault. Your father, he made choices, and Lily made hers. They're the ones who should feel ashamed, not you." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression hardening. "I don't think I can ever forgive them," she said quietly. "Either of them." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. "You don't have to," she said finally. "Not now, not ever. You take the time you need to heal. That's what matters." As they sat in silence, the faint sound of the front door opening reached their ears. Sarah's body tensed and Emma's head snapped up, her expression a mix of fear and anger. David stepped into the kitchen, his face haggard and drawn. He looked at them both, his eyes pleading. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with desperation. "No," Emma said sharply, standing so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "You don't get to talk to me, not after what you've done." "Emma, please," David began, but Sarah raised a hand, cutting him off. "She said no," Sarah said, her voice cold and unwavering. "And I think you've done enough damage for one night." David's shoulders slumped, but he didn't move. His gaze shifted to Sarah, his expression a mix of guilt and desperation. "I made a mistake," he said weakly. "I know that. But this is my family. I can't lose you." Sarah stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and stepped toward him. "You already have," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. "This family was built on trust, David, and you shattered it. You don't get to walk back in here and act like everything can be fixed with an apology." David's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But then he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging further. Without another word he turned and walked back out the door, leaving Sarah and Emma alone once more. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky mirroring the mood inside the house. Sarah sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, which was muted and playing some mindless morning show. She hadn't slept, her mind too restless to allow her any peace. Emma came down the stairs, her expression guarded but less raw than the night before. She sat beside her mother, pulling a blanket over her lap. They didn't speak at first, the silence between them not uncomfortable but reflective, like the quiet after a storm. "I don't know what to do now," Emma said finally, her voice small. "It feels like everything is ruined." Sarah placed an arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. "It's not ruined," she said softly. "It's just different now, and it's going to take time, but we'll figure it out. Together." Emma leaned into her mother, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't know how to face people after this. What if they think I'm like him?" Sarah stiffened at the thought but quickly shook her head. "No one would ever think that," she said firmly. "You are nothing like him. You are strong, kind, and brave. Don't let his mistakes define you." They sat like that for a while, the weight of the night before slowly beginning to lift. It wasn't gone. It wouldn't be gone for a long time, but for the first time, Sarah felt a small glimmer of hope. They had survived the worst of it, and though the road ahead would be long and painful, they would walk it together. And as the house slowly filled with the soft sounds of a new day, Sarah resolved to rebuild the life they had lost. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be theirs, and no one would take that away from them again. Weeks passed, but the air around the house still felt heavy with the aftermath of the revelation. Life moved forward, but it did so with an awkward limp, as though the family were relearning how to exist in the same space. Emma had grown quieter, retreating into herself in a way that broke Sarah's heart. The bright, carefree girl who had once filled their home with laughter seemed to have been replaced by someone more guarded, someone carrying a burden far too heavy for her age. David had not returned to the house. After their confrontation, Sarah had made it clear that his presence was no longer welcome. He had tried reaching out, calls, messages, even flowers left on the doorstep, but Sarah ignored them all. He didn't deserve her attention, not after what he had done. She had consulted a lawyer and begun the process of severing ties with him, though the very thought of the legal battles to come left her exhausted. Lily had disappeared as well, avoiding Emma entirely. Word of the scandal had spread like wildfire, and though Sarah tried to shield Emma from the gossip, there was no escaping it entirely. The whispers followed her daughter everywhere, at school, on social media, even in their own neighborhood. Sarah had heard one of the neighbors muttering about what a shame it was as she passed by, and it had taken every ounce of restraint not to snap back. One evening, as Sarah sat at the dining table sorting through legal documents, Emma entered the room quietly, a hesitant look on her face. She carried her laptop under her arm, and her hands trembled slightly as she set it down on the table. "Mom," she began, her voice shaky. I need to show you something." Sarah frowned, her heart sinking at the apprehension in her daughter's tone. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Emma opened the laptop and clicked on a folder. A series of screenshots filled the screen, text messages, photos, and emails. As Sarah leaned closer, her stomach turned. The messages were between David and Lily, spanning months. They were explicit, manipulative, and damning. "I found these on my phone," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily synced her account to my laptop once, and I guess she forgot to log out. I didn't know what to do with them." Sarah stared at the screen, bile rising in her throat as she read through the vile exchanges. David's words were insidious, laced with charm and control, and Lily's responses were a mixture of vulnerability and desperation. It was worse than Sarah had imagined. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated manipulation of a young, impressionable girl. "This changes everything," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling with anger. She looked at Emma, who was staring down at her hands, her face pale. "We have to report this." Emma looked up at her, panic flashing in her eyes. "But what if it makes things worse? What if people blame me? Or they think I knew?" Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hands in hers, holding them firmly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady. "This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. And if we don't do something, he's going to keep hurting people. We can't let that happen." Emma nodded slowly, though tears slipped down her cheeks. "Okay," she whispered. "But will it ever really be over?" Sarah hesitated, her heart aching for her daughter. "It'll never disappear," she admitted. "But it will get easier, and we'll get through it. Together." The next day, Sarah contacted the authorities, handing over the evidence and ensuring that David's actions would be investigated. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be grueling and painful, but necessary. For Emma, for Lily, and for anyone else who might have been caught in his web. As Sarah watched Emma later that night, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she felt a spark of hope. The scars from this ordeal would remain, but they wouldn't define them. They were survivors, not victims, and no matter how dark the path ahead seemed, they would walk it together. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself a small, genuine smile. They had faced the shadows of truth, and though it had nearly broken them, they were still standing. That, she knew, was where healing could finally begin,